Hello, hello, honeys. Welcome back to the Beesness. I hope you all had a fantastic Memorial Day weekend. I myself was lucky enough to be able to go boating just about the entirety of it with my auntie and her immediate family. For me personally, the weekend was a lot colder at the start than it was at the end. I wish it had been a little more even, consistent temperature, but what are you gonna do? And one last thing before we begin today, honeys, we did have to delay our guest episode that was scheduled for May, as you all know. Well, it'll be coming out the first week of June, so prepare yourselves, get excited to hear from one of my mentors who has steered my career along the way and in part made Highbrow Honey possible. And now, with no further ado, your recap of the headlines from May 18th through the 24th. Here we go. Beginning as we always do with updates on prior headlines, and this one's a bit of a throwback to fall of 2024, we heard the Mediterranean Alliance for Wetlands has launched a campaign against the Guggenheim Museum's planned expansion in Spain. The museum's efforts to expand its Bilbao outpost are now being held up by activists wanting to protect the local Urdaibai Biosphere Reserve. A summary of this background: the proposed museum is slated to include the town of Guernica, made famous by a certain Picasso painting you may have heard of, plus the Urdaibai Reserve, with the expected visitorship jumping to at least 140,000 people annually. Yet the planned expansion has been controversial in the area since its initial proposal because, although the development could help revitalize the region economically and culturally, it may also cause an enormous amount of damage to the protected natural area. A social media post by the Alliance Group explains, quote, a planned extension of the Guggenheim Museum into the special area of conservation of the Biosphere Reserve risks undermining biodiversity, water quality, and the integrity of conservation frameworks, end quote, citing the fact that, quote, 77 organizations have warned UNESCO, Ramsar Secretariat, and the Spanish government about the irreversible consequences of this expansion on biodiversity and water resources, end quote. We'll update you as the legal battle proceeds. We additionally learned that the EU has sanctioned a Russian museum in Crimea. The European Union released its latest round of sanctions against Russia on Tuesday of last week, and for the first time, it included a Russian museum on the list. The so-called Chersonezy State Museum Preserve on the outskirts of the city of Sevastopol in Crimea. Its director, Elena Morozova, is separately named on the list of sanctioned entities, along with 16 other Russian individuals and 58 Russian organizations. All received their sanctions for, quote, undermining or threatening the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of Ukraine, end quote. The Chersonezy itself was opened in July of 2024 and built by Russia's defense ministry with funds from Transneft, a state-controlled corporation. It's managed by a cleric appointed by Russian President Vladimir Putin and includes a Russian Orthodox monastery plus several other institutions, namely the Museum of Christianity and the Museum of Crimea and Novorossiya, aka the term Russia uses for the annexed territories in Crimea. Now, this headline caught our attention, honeys, because it is, again, the first time the European Union has sanctioned a Russian museum, but it's not the first time it has sanctioned a museum's staff member, which is an interesting twist. A notable precedent/example from 2023 was Canada's addition of Mikhail Poitrovsky, long-serving director of St. Petersburg State Hermitage Museum, to its sanction list for supporting the war in Ukraine. The nation was the first country to impose sanctions against Poitrovsky. And here's where the follow-up part actually comes in. Konstantin Akinsha, an art historian and one of the signatories of our previously covered open letter asking ICOM to dismiss Russia in Le Monde, told sources for Today that the inclusion of this museum on the EU sanctions list is a, quote, extremely important step, end quote. He said, quote, leading Russian museums and their directors have become willing executors of Putin's policies in the occupied Ukrainian territories. I hope the EU's decision will serve as a strong argument for Russia's expulsion from ICOM, end quote. We learned last week that a Frida Kahlo museum will open in Mexico City this September as well. The new museum, dedicated to the life and art of Frida Frida Kahlo will open in Mexico City's historic Coyoacan district and will more specifically be set in the Casa Roja, a private residence purchased by Kahlo's parents and passed down through the family over generations before the gifting of the property for museum purposes by Kahlo's grandniece. Its conversion into an art institution was done by the New York-based architecture firm the Rockwell Group. The forthcoming museum will also incorporate the nearby Casa Azul property, the home the artist was raised in. Mara Romeo Kahlo, the grandniece donor, said in a statement, quote, "Frida's legacy belongs to the world, but it begins here, on this land, in these homes, and in the culture that shaped her. Museo Casa Kahlo will allow us to tell new stories, share family secrets, host new voices, and build a future that honors her spirit," end quote. The week also saw a massive artwork for trans visibility unveiled on the National Mall. On Saturday, May 17th, approximately 260 quilt panels lined the National Mall, spelling out the message, "Freedom to Be," as part of a temporary installation celebrating trans joy and resilience. The artwork was organized by the ACLU, and Abdul Corlett, creator of the Freedom to Be project and head of the brand for the ACLU, told sources that trans individuals from 35 states and D.C. participated in quilt-making events held around the nation, from rural church basements to Brooklyn Museum events, in preparation for the installation across the last year. We, of course, noticed this headline because the artwork was so intentionally unveiled right as the ACLU is challenging a Tennessee ban on gender-affirming healthcare before the Supreme Court. Furthermore, its display format, the 6x6-foot panels, recalls the 1987 Names Project AIDS Memorial quilt presented at the same location. This was done because Corlett said he believes that every generation has a responsibility to contribute to the legacy of the Names Project AIDS Memorial quilt to create joy as well as to resist. He said, quote, "We are giving folks the opportunity to memorialize their very real lives, even as there are so many efforts across this country to erase them from all aspects of public life," end quote. We also learned that archaeologists have discovered a new style of ancient Aboriginal rock art. In a February study published by the journal Australian Archaeology, which is gaining art world attention now, researchers proposed that some zoomorphic rock paintings found in the western Kimberley region of the country, dated back to the mid to late Holocene age, or about 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, should be classified as a new type of ancient Aboriginal art that they have dubbed linear naturalistic figures, or LNF. These LNF paintings had previously been grouped with Australia's oldest known rock art style, the Irregular Infill Animal Period, or IIAP, which dates back to 17,500 years ago. But this new study found that 98 of the 4,200 IIAP motifs, quote, contained characteristics inconsistent with the rock art style's conventions, leading the researchers to argue that these works should be categorized under LNF, end quote. Now you may be wondering, it's all thousands of year old rock art, why does this matter? And the answer is this. LNF's placement in this timeline indicates a return to animal forms after several millennia of mostly human figure rock art, but it left us in the dark as to why this return happened. Researchers theorized that for some reason, LNF was necessary to emphasize the relationship between animals and humans during this time period of 7,000 to 5,000 years ago. Lead postdoctoral researcher Anna Paula Mata says, quote, "Rock art is special in that it allows us to explore how people perceived themselves and the world while also examining social relationships, symbolism, and kinship," end quote. And a truly bizarre headline from the last week, honeys. A Russian university chancellor has died inside of a Soviet-era statue. According to reports in the local media, Nikolai Chesnikov, chancellor of Moscow's State Academy of Physical Education, passed away last Thursday at the site of a 279-foot-tall World War II-era monument in the Russian city of Volgograd at age 68. Chesnikov had traveled for an unofficial visit of the statue titled The Motherland Calls from 1967, which commemorates the Battle of Stalingrad and remains Europe's tallest statue as well as a symbol of Soviet resistance during World War II. The chancellor collapsed while touring its interior, and after he was pronounced dead at the scene, authorities launched a preliminary investigation, but no foul play is suspected, and the cause of his death has not been disclosed as of the time of this recording. We further heard that over 1,000 faculty members at the School of Visual arts in Manhattan are officially unionized now under the United Auto Workers as of May 22nd, after a 2/3 majority vote in favor of doing so. The new union is prioritizing, quote, scheduled pay increases in accordance with inflation, compensation for out-of-classroom labor, and protecting and expanding benefits, end quote. A current adjunct professor in the art history and visual and critical studies department, who once held a full-time role by the name of Justin Elm, who was also a key organizer, told Hyperallergic that he wanted to emphasize the grassroots effort that led to this unionization and added, quote, at the most basic level, we're seeking a contract comparable to what other adjuncts have fought for in New York City, end quote. The SVA's statement said in part that it had encouraged all eligible faculty to participate in that unionization vote and that, quote, we are committed to preserving and strengthening our academic community for years to come and look forward to bargaining in good faith with the faculty union's representatives, end quote. However, honeys, we have to sandwich in some bad news with the good. The Lucas Museum of LA has laid off 22 employees. The Los Angeles Times, first to report on this story, described a, quote, shocking and chaotic, end quote, scene on May 15th when the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, co-founded by Star Wars filmmaker George Lucas and his wife Melody Hobson, laid off 14% of its full-time staff as well as 7 part-time employees. The affected staff members were allegedly pulled into morning meetings with human resources and given until 2 p.m. the same day to leave the premises. Statements from the museum clarified that most of the cuts were in the learning and engagement and museum services teams, adding that the laid-off staff received severance packages and the museum will, quote, continue hiring new roles in strategic operational areas, end quote, in anticipation of its 2026 opening. But a couple things about this headline caught our attention, honeys, mostly that there was no specific reason given for the cuts, unlike other U.S. institutions we've seen recently announce layoffs like the Brooklyn Museum, the Guggenheim, and SF MoMA, all of which cited financial challenges. It's also concerning to us at Highbrow Honey that they let go so many from their education department, including Regan Pro, Deputy Director of Public Programs and Social Impact, and Bernardo Rondo, Curator of Film Programs. Our sources referred to an anonymous, now former employee who said that much of the ongoing dysfunction stemmed from a, quote, poor discrepancy between what George Lucas thinks a museum is and what the leadership thinks it is, end quote, which may explain these cuts. There is some evidence for this potential internal misalignment found in the museum's February announcement that its inaugural director and CEO, Sandra Jackson Dumont, would be stepping down after 5 years and that her role would be divided between Lucas, overseeing most of the quote-unquote content direction, and former 20th Century Fox and Paramount Pictures chairman CEO Jim Giannopoulos as interim CEO of the Lucas Museum. And a little side note for the honeys, this just goes to show that you never know what life has in store for you, because I was real bummed when I didn't get a Lucas Museum position a few months ago, and, well, And the headline, I would say, is our biggest from the last week. Major protests by multiple stakeholders occurred after the Whitney Museum canceled its performance about Palestinian mourning. The lobby of the Whitney in New York became the site of protests by arts and culture workers on May 23rd during its Free Friday Night event hosted from 7 to 10 p.m. The activists quietly unfurled a Palestinian flag and a banner reading, quote, creativity does not have to rely on death, end quote, from the mezzanine level, while activists on the ground floor distributed brochures which demanded, quote, the removal of board members tied to genocide, militarism, and apartheid, end quote, as well as an end to, quote, institutional art washing, censorship, surveillance, and policing of artists, end quote. Museum security briefly barred entry to the museum and its galleries after the beginning of the protest actions. The aim of these protesters was to call out the Whitney's leadership for its cancellation of a performance piece by a group of artists in its Independent Study Program, or ISP for short, which was titled No Aesthetics Outside My Freedom, Mourning, Militancy, and Performance. The cancellation came only 2 days before it was set to take place on May 14th as part of programming for an exhibition organized by one of the program's cohorts. The hour-and-a-half-long performance was described by those involved as an invitation to mourn those who have suffered over the decades of Israeli occupation in Gaza and the West Bank through the performers' interpretation of scores written by Natalie Diaz, Christina Sharp and Brandon Shimoda, which convey the themes of grief, endurance, and defiance. But a Whitney spokesperson confirmed the cancellation after museum leadership viewed a recording of the work's initial presentation at the Poetry Project, where it was staged in collaboration with Jewish Currents. That iteration, quote, opened with an address made by one of the performers to attendees requesting that they leave the room if they, quote, believe in Israel in any incarnation, end quotes. The museum stated this was not a decision made lightly, but it was, quote, clear and necessary. This decision was not about the topics discussed, but because their presentation violated the standards agreed to by all members of our community, including ISP participants, end quote. All the same, the question of censorship looms as ISP Associate Director Sarah Nadal-Malzio tried to stop this cancellation, arguing that the ISP had agreed to stage the performance without that particular introduction, but the Whitney did not change its decision. Nadal-Malzio also says the Whitney never added a sign-up link on its website for visitors to attend the public performance of No Aesthetic Outside My Freedom as it did with other scheduled events. Members of the museum's curatorial and communications staff asked to review the artworks and descriptions as well. Wrote the exhibition's curators in a statement published by Art News, quote, the Whitney's decision to cancel the show does not come as a complete surprise, as for almost the past 3 weeks, our capstone projects across all ISP cohorts have undergone an intense level of scrutiny from the senior administration of the museum. We as curators stand by the works of all the artists in our show and condemn the museum's actions, end quote. Notably, the other cohorts from ISP are also protesting. One group of artists have withdrawn their work from a capstone exhibition at Westbeth Gallery, and the Critical Studies cohort canceled its symposium slated to be held May 18th entirely. Although the demonstrators peacefully departed the Whitney lobby around 9 p.m., the activists said upon leaving, quote, this will not be the last time you see us. Keep your eyes open because the community sees you, end quote, and we do expect to have follow-ups for you on this story next week. The last week also saw New York City cultural organizations publicly ask for more city funding after the federal grant losses. Several dozen NYC arts and culture advocates coordinated by the organization New Yorkers for Arts and Culture rallied in the rain outside City Hall on May 21st to call for increased funding to the sector ahead of city council hearings on Mayor Eric Adams's $115 billion executive budget proposal for the 2026 fiscal year, which is expected to be adopted by the end of June. This proposal recommends allocating $215.1 million to the Department of Cultural Affairs of New York, which council member Carlina Rivera, chair of the city's Committee on Cultural Affairs and Libraries, told Hyperallergic was, quote, a step in the right direction, end quote, but these advocates are pushing for the mayor to add an additional $30 million, or less than 0.3% of the city budget, to the department's baseline in the finalized expense plans. The current plan is notable because it restores and permanently baselines the $45 million allocation provided last fiscal year to the Department of Cultural Affairs, or DCLA, and that represented the first significant raise to its baseline, or the set of funds which carries over to the next fiscal year, in more than a decade, according to the department. But these advocates argue that that would not address the millions that have been lost in federal grant funding from the National Endowment of Humanities, National Endowment of the Arts, and Institute of Library and Museum Sciences. President of the District Council 37 Local 1503 Union, Manus Gallagher, who also works at the Met, emphasized the need to support the city's cultural workers, saying, quote, when city funding goes toward these organizations, it flows to our communities. Union cultural workers spend their hard-earned wages in our neighborhoods right here in New York City, end quote. These actions are worth our attention, as last year's proposed $151 million for the DCLA was eventually raised to $254 million after pushback from cultural advocates and organizations. So these protests may very well work. Furthermore, the mayor's current expense plan draft, dubbed the best budget ever in clear reference to Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, comes amid steadily increasing instability in the cultural sector resulting from, as we've covered, everything from slashed federal spending to layoffs at museums nationwide and Trump's global tariff war, even as most are still recovering from post-pandemic attendance drops. This final budget could have huge effects, honeys, on the economics of New York and thus the U.S. at large, especially in the art scene across the next fiscal year. Last week was also a really big one for repatriation. The Met of New York recently announced that it will return 3 ancient sculptures dating from the 3rd to 2nd millennium BCE to Iraq, estimated to be collectively worth $500,000. These include a Sumerian vessel made of gypsum alabaster and 2 Babylonian terracotta sculptures depicting a male head and female head, respectively. The Met said it was making the return after it had, quote, received new information, end quote, amid the investigation into Robin Sims, a dealer accused of being a member of a network that traded in looted artifacts and in cooperation with the Manhattan DA's office. A press release from that office said that the Sims investigation has resulted in the seizure of 135 antiquities valued at more than $58 million. The office had found that the head of a male was smuggled out of Iraq and was in Sims's possession in London by 1971. He then sold the sculpture to the Met the next year, where it remained until it was seized by the Antiquities Trafficking Unit of the DA's office. The district attorney, Alvin Bragg Jr., said in his press statement, quote, "We continue to recover and return antiquities that were trafficked by Robin Sims. That is a testament to the hard work of attorneys, analysts, and investigators who are committed to undoing the significant damage traffickers have caused to our worldwide cultural heritage," end quote. Meanwhile, the Fowler Museum at the University of California, Los Angeles voluntarily returned 11 objects to an Aboriginal community in Northern Australia in a handover ceremony which occurred May 20th. These included a kangaroo tooth headband and 10 glass spearheads, some of which are over 100 years old and have deep cultural importance to the Larrakia community. This story is another success for the Return of Cultural Heritage program to identify and facilitate the safe return of cultural heritage items from overseas institutions with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collections, carried out by an Indigenous-led national cultural institution solely dedicated to the diverse history, cultures, and heritage of those same peoples, referred to as AIATSIS. And the Manhattan DA's office repatriated 8 more artifacts recovered by the Antiquities Trafficking Unit to Peru on May 15th. They were mostly funerary items illegally taken from tombs in northern Peru during the 1960s through 70s, including a ceramic portrait vessel dating to 1000 to 700 BCE from the Chavan culture, one of the earliest pre-Columbian societies in the region. And for this particular repatriation, the timing is important. It comes amid growing attention on antiquities in the nation after a recent finding of approximately 5,000-year-old human remains in an elaborate funerary site at Aspero, a coastal settlement associated with the Corral civilization. And our last story for this week, honeys, an art historian is protesting the restoration of Louisville monuments graffitied in 2020. The art historian in question, Chris Reitz, is also chair of Louisville's Public Art Commission and has announced that he would leave his post amid plans to restore a statue of King Louis XVI graffitied by protesters in 2020 following the police killing of Breonna Taylor. The statue in question was produced by Achille Valois, a member of Jacques-Louis David's studio, and was first erected in Montpellier, France in 1829, before being given to Louisville by that city in 1966. The first instance of its destruction came May 28th of that year when a man pulled off one of the sculpture's hands, but as protests continued across the nation and long-standing monuments fell over the duration of that summer, the Louis XVI statue was graffitied and eventually taken away by officials who claimed safety concerns. Reitz also accused the city of Louisville of attempting to, quote, erase all evidence, end quote, of local protests on their 5-year anniversary in an op-ed published in the Courier-Journal. He raised concerns about the cost of restoring the sculpture, described by him as being, quote, beyond repair, end quote, and questioned the true motivations for paying the $200,000 US to do so. Reitz wrote, quote, "I fear the real aim of these funds is to send a message that our city is hostile to anti-police protests and that we prefer to pretend Miss Taylor's killing never happened than face the fact that not enough has changed to prevent such tragedies in the future," end quote. This headline is so notable, honeys, because of the content of it, the protest nature of it, and the fact that this resignation comes as high-ranking U.S. politicians continue to argue over how best to deal with public monuments, especially in the light of recent executive orders. All right, and I think that's enough for one episode of The Beesness, enough for the week. We will save save the last little bit of administrative updates for our next non-blondes update. Stay well, honeys. Stay healthy, stay hydrated, all that good stuff. Make sure you're taking care of yourselves because it matters. It really does. Until next time, honeys, be sure to like, follow, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we will talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.